Welcome to this explainer. We're unpacking a really fascinating study today titled 90-Year Trends Reveal Sharpest Insect Declines in the Mid-20th Century. You know, when we hear about the insect apocalypse or massive bug die-offs, we usually picture it as a strictly modern crisis, something caused by just the last 20 or 30 years of human activity. But what if we've been looking at the completely wrong timeline? Let's dive right in and challenge that assumption by looking back almost a whole century. 1,200,000, that is a staggering number of historical species records that researchers analyzed to build this 90-year timeline. And looking at a dataset this massive is absolutely crucial because it helps us avoid a dangerous illusion scientists call a shifting baseline. Think about it. If you only start studying insect populations from, say, the 1980s or 90s, you might miss the biggest drops entirely. Why? Because your starting point, your baseline, is already artificially low. To really grasp how our environment has changed, let's meet the two protagonists of our story. First, we have saprophytic beetles. These are insects that absolutely depend on deadwood and forests to survive. And second, we have butterflies, which mainly rely on open, agriculturally managed habitats and meadows. We're tracking these two very distinct groups because, well, nature doesn't just react uniformly to human impact. A tractor plowing a field affects a butterfly completely differently than a fallen tree in a forest affects a beetle. Now, geographically speaking, this story unfolds in Switzerland, right along the Alps in Central Europe. And researchers didn't just look at one single backyard. They tracked these insects across 6 highly diverse biozones from 1930 all the way to 2021. We're talking everything from intensely farmed lowlands all the way up to freezing alpine peaks. It's basically a perfect natural laboratory to see exactly where and exactly when these insect populations shifted. And following this 90-year timeline reveals a huge plot twist. We start establishing our baseline in the 1930s. Then, moving into the 1950s, post-World War II agricultural mechanization really kicks into high gear. Later on, in the 1980s, climate warming starts to sharply accelerate. So what's the core finding of this entire massive study? Well, the sharpest, most devastating crash in insect populations didn't actually happen recently. It hit right in that mid-20th century window between the 1930s and the 1960s. But what is truly revealing is how the paths of our two protagonists diverge. During that mid-century window, both groups took a really massive hit. But as we move past the 1980s, the beetle populations actually stabilized. In many areas, they even recovered, getting pretty close back to their 1930 baseline. But the butterflies? No such luck. Their species richness just plummeted, bottomed out in the 1980s, and essentially never bounced back. So why the totally different outcomes? It comes down to contrasting historical impacts. Back in the mid-20th century, the explosion of agricultural mechanization, bigger tractors, larger fields, heavy pesticide use, and losing structural elements like hedges, that devastated both groups by making the landscape completely uniform. But in recent decades, things shifted. A warming climate actually aided some warm-adapted beetles, and newer biodiversity-friendly forest management left more deadwood on the ground for them to thrive. Butterflies, though, remain trapped in highly intensified open farmlands. This divergence really comes down to the finer details of the crisis. It wasn't just a random die-off, you see. If an insect was a habitat specialist, meaning it needed very specific, exact conditions to survive, it suffered massive losses compared to more adaptable generalists. We also see that cold-adapted species really lost out as the climate warmed up. And smaller butterflies, which literally can't fly far enough to find new homes when their habitats get destroyed, suffered the most severe and permanent losses. Which brings us to our final takeaway. The researchers concluded that shifted baselines and climate change effects absolutely must be considered when we're setting restoration goals. And this leaves us with a pretty provocative question to ponder. How can we properly restore nature if our baseline for what's normal is already based on a totally depleted ecosystem? Because if we're only aiming to bring nature back to what it looked like in the 1980s, we are aiming for a landscape that has already lost a massive share of its diversity. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this changes the way you look at the history of the world right outside your window.